Welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 3, Episode 8. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
Well, Steve, great to be back on the mic with you again now. Once again, to remind our listeners and viewers that we're now weekly. So this is great. We get to catch up. So much is happening. We got so much to talk about. We got great guests. And speaking of great guests, we have an amazing guest in this episode, Daniel McCarthy, Assistant Professor of Marketing at Emory University, Goizueta Business School out of Wharton. He came out of Wharton with more degrees than a thermometer. This guy. How did you get to know Dan, or how did you come across him?
It was kind of a two-step process. I've been interested, because I'm a geek like that, in the unit economics of some of these digitally native vertical brands. And I ran into an article that was dissecting Blue Apron's, the meal service, Blue Apron's cost of customer acquisition and retention and all these kinds of things. And it was a tour de force that this guy had kind of backed into from public data. And I thought it was really fascinating. I didn't pay much attention to who had written it. And then, I don't know, a year later or something, I was talking to Peter Fader from Wharton, and he mentioned this PhD student of his, Dan McCarthy. And he said, oh, he did this Blue Apron thing, and he's doing all this interesting analysis on customer lifetime value. And I'm like, wait a minute, that's the guy. And so anyway, then we've subsequently had several conversations, and I've been following his work for, I guess, about the last 3 years, something like that. So good guy, really unique perspective.
Yep. Yeah, it's a great discussion, and we'll get to that a bit later. But let's jump into news of the week. So as is the case in many of our episodes, let's start talking about Amazon. A couple of things on the go there. Televisions, tuition, and hiring. So speak to what you heard about all three of those.
Well, not too surprisingly, Amazon announced they're going to be doing their own private brand TV. It's just a continuation of this strategy of developing their own products. I think this is maybe the first step into some bigger ticket items, higher dollar items where they can have great technology and an attractive price point and use it to target. So who knows? Maybe eventually they'll be coming out with the Amazon car or Amazon refrigerator or whatever. But televisions. And then, as we seem to have just about every week, we've got news of Amazon's hiring. They announced 125,000 new jobs in the U.S. on top of what we talked about, I think, a couple of weeks ago about these technology jobs and administrative jobs they're adding, raising their wages, offering tuition to some of their players. So I think, or some of their team members. So, it's just part of this hiring crunch that I think is going on where, it's just a war for talent and people have to, or retailers have to keep kind of upping the ante to be able to keep and retain people.
Well, it's so interesting. I remember, years and years ago, there's that startling factoid that Walmart had more people in uniform than the U.S. military. And I think that's starting to become the case with Amazon. And now they're rolling in the same benefits, join, serve your country and get an education, right? Now, serve Amazon and get an education. And in Canada as well, they announced 15,000 new hires. Now, we should refer our listeners back to our interview with Brad Stone, who wrote such great books on Amazon. And he makes the point that, well, yes, at the warehouse level anyway, they have, in some ways on purpose, tremendous turnover. So It's not a net number, right? I mean, I can't remember if he told us a percentage, but, listen, in some mass merchants, you're 50% turnover at the store floor. So let's assume it's double digits. You're not really hiring that many people. You're replenishing to some degree, right?
Yeah, for sure. There's a ton of turnover there, but certainly if you look at their overall growth, they keep just adding huge numbers,
undeniably,
more distribution centers, you name it. But yeah, it's not a net number. That would be a lot more helpful if they would quote that occasionally, but so far not so much.
Okay, I got a question for you. Imagine your brand strategy at Amazon, and you're going to bring out a TV. Is it a Basics TV, or is it part of the Echo line? Like that, you do have a kind of a choice. Would you take one path or the other? I mean, one is I'm going to bring out a TV that's a great TV, like many Basics product are, stripped down, good value, or I go to the Echo, which is top drawer quality. Would you have a point of view on that at this, if you're sitting in that chair?
I'd probably go for, a lot of times in retail, we talk about good, better, best in terms of the assortment. If I were Amazon, I think
Mm-hmm.
I would go good, better, maybe not best. Have an attractive opening price point that's nicely featured, have some step ups in terms of the quality. I
Yeah.
think when you start to get to the real high end, that's much more brand dominant. I don't know if they yet have the credibility, but I think
Mm.
they'll eventually get there. Why not? I mean, it's a good margin business potentially for them if they
Yeah.
don't have to invest in all the advertising and the showrooms and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's fair. And of course, they're not the first to do it. In one way, a media company getting into TVs or a TV company getting into media. I think of Sony, right?
Sure.
Who makes electronics and you watch their movies on their television. So it's not a novel idea, but like in many ways, there's some interesting components to it. Um, let's move on to NTD. So, put out a report talking about consumers still spending more per trip, which is interesting, right? Because we
Right.
knew that was happening in the COVID era. I want to go less. I'm going to have bigger baskets, but yet there seems to be, and I'm not sure. Love to hear your opinion. Is this a change in consumer behavior, or are we still in the pandemic era enough that people haven't quite got back to their normal behavior? What do you think?
Well, I'll give you a bold, I'm not sure. It is a bit surprising to me for the reasons you mentioned. We've still got this dynamic of certain parts of the U.S. for sure, where there aren't a lot of people vaccinated, relatively speaking, and there does seem to be
Mm,
some pullback from going out. So it could be mostly a COVID phenomenon, but at the same time, a lot of the folks like Walmart and Target and others that benefited from this consolidation, maybe more people just said, you know what, this is just more convenient to go get a lot of stuff all at the same place. I don't necessarily have to go to three or four places. So I don't know. I expected it to revert more back to where we were before, but with the tick up in COVID, maybe that's still kind of an overhang.
it's a fascinating point because back to our last two episodes on department stores. Department stores kind of had a bit of a I described it as a renaissance, but at least they had a tailwind because people wanted to go to a place to find many things
Right.
versus many places, thinking that would reduce their risk and all that stuff. And I wonder if consumers went, huh, this was actually pretty convenient. I rediscovered the benefit of going to places where they can get more stuff, or fill their basket or check more things off their list. It's so interesting, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I think when you think about someone like Target or Walmart, they're in so many categories, and in many cases, they've Target in particular has added some or continue to add some great private brands. And so,
Yeah.
when you think about kind of your everyday
Stop and
store,
shop.
yeah,
Yeah.
you can go to Target as many people do 2-3 times a week. That's a really different
Mm.
dynamic than the department stores when you're lucky if you get somebody in 5 or 6 times
Yeah,
a
yeah.
year. But I don't know. I think we still have a long way to go, really, before we can sort out how much of this is COVID overhang, how much is pent up demand, how much of it is government stimulus. But if you look at the spending numbers for the past month that were released earlier this week, uh, overall consumer spending in the U.S. was up 20% on a 2-year basis. So that's very, very robust. So, I mean, it seems like just about everybody is
Yeah.
spending a lot more money. So
Yeah.
how much that factors into this distribution, I don't know, but certainly at this point, the consumer is out there spending money, spending
Mm.
a little bit differently. Shift more to eating out, a little less grocery, a lot more apparel. So some of these things not totally unexpected, but overall, a really good picture.
I was trying to unpack those numbers a bit because we're trying to do the same thing here in Canada. And this was my week, or last week was my time to talk to all the many, many executives I talked to create a report every quarter for Retail Council of Canada. And a couple observations came out about numbers like that. One, there's some inflationary pricing baked into some of those numbers. So we're
Yes,
now seeing, in Canada, the number came out highest inflation number in 18 years. I see 4.5% in the US. So, the sales numbers, I think there's
right,
inflationary pressures baked in. I think there's also unintentional upselling. So I'll give you an example. So I wanted to get a printer for my daughter, and she wanted a laser color printer, which is not your cheap and cheerful one. And I found a nice one online from reviews that was about 350, 375 Canadian.
Mm.
Well, I went to Staples. It didn't exist. Just it's gone. Like they have no inventory. And then I checked everywhere. There's no inventory anywhere. So I wound up buying a $700 unit, right? And why did I buy a $700 unit?
It's all that podcast
Well,
money, man.
Yeah, I guess. Sponsors. It, she didn't need a $700 unit. She's not making, she's not printing off reports,
Right?
like you are in a business. And talking to the retailers, they're like, there's a shortage of a lot of stuff from
Interesting.
chips and that, and they're saying we are seeing some choices made at the store shelf, so to speak, or virtual shelf that really I'm substituting up, not
Right.
down.
Right. More likely
Because
to do
that's
that.
all there is.
Right.
I don't know. We're living in pure speculation world, but it's interesting, right?
Well, hopefully we'll start to get more information about the unit volume, because to your point, there's definitely price inflation. I hadn't really thought about that trading up kind of phenomenon. But, when consumers are feeling more flush, when they haven't spent on themselves for 18 months, I think there are a bunch of things that kind of push you up the price ladder, so to speak, or maybe get you to buy that one more item or spoil yourself a little bit. So I think that's all part of the equation right now.
Let's talk about Casper. So our friends at Casper have been on a wild ride, but that ride seems to be, for some of them, over. They're making some big changes that don't look so positive, right?
Yeah. Casper's has been an interesting business. They were really one of the first kind of breakout digitally native vertical brands, that got to $100 million pretty quickly. They were one of the first to go public, and had talked about opening as many as 800 stores, which I thought when they announced that was pretty crazy, but it doesn't look like they're even going to get to 80. It's a business that has just struggled to make money. They laid off a bunch of C-suite people last week, or in the last week, reduced a bunch of people at headquarters. And so, it's really a brand that I think has been more hype than substance. Gross margins have been challenging the entire time. They've spent a ton on marketing, and, it just really created a business that looks to be pretty profit proof. And it's particularly interesting now. I mean, there's a lot of competition, but you would think with the effects of COVID, with more traffic going online without having to pay for it, and with the home industry on fire, this would be a time where they'd be lighting it up. But I think some of their spending and just sheer competition has caught up with them. So we'll see. But this doesn't look very promising.
Yeah, we wish them the best. We wish everyone the best. But my comment would be their distribution strategy. So I observe Casper suddenly everywhere, right? So they went direct to consumer, and then they seem to go really quickly. And this used to be the case for as on scene TV product, right? It used to start as on the phone, go to the web, and then go to retail, right? That was its life cycle. And by the time it hit to retail, it was in its final kind of thing. But, it's available at the shopping channels. It's available at department stores. Like instead of opening stores, I think even Costco, you could buy a Casper. I wonder if they spread themselves too thin or lost. It seemed Casper was everywhere except direct. So, and those are expensive relationships, right? I mean, everybody wants to make their dollar, right?
Yeah.
So.
Well, on the one hand, this idea of partnering with major retailers to create awareness and lower your direct marketing cost, I think, is generally a valid one. But yeah, they went pretty broad, pretty quickly. I think it was a bit of a land grab. I think so many of these digitally native brands, as we've talked about, we'll talk about with Dan, there's this difficulty of spending so much money to acquire customers online and then retain them. And so I think they started to hit that wall, and the answer for them initially was, well, we'll open our own stores. But that's not so easy, and that consumes a lot of capital. It takes a lot of time. So I think they got into this place where how are they going to grow and kind of get this land grab done when you had Purple and a bunch of Tough and Needle, a bunch of other
Yep.
Sleep 8, is that their name? A bunch of other competitors. And so they probably did spread themselves too thin. So now they've got to, I guess, go back and try a reload, but they've got a big hill to climb, unfortunately.
My last comment was on the positive side. They've got a brand name. I mean,
Absolutely.
when I think of Casper, and that's hard to do. That is very hard to do. By the way, I talked to the woman who helped create that, Emily Hayward, who was our guest. She worked on that brand. They've got, when I think of their type of mattresses, bed in a box, I think Casper. So that's powerful. That's not nothing, right? So it gives them something to rebuild back from. Let's talk about Walmart. They announced 32 million plus their Walmart Plus program. 32 million members, and they've ebbed and flowed on a Prime-like Plus program loyalty thing with benefits for years. They seem to have, 32 million people. They seem to have nailed something here. What are you thinking about their program and its relative success?
I suppose you can look at this as glass is half full or glass is half empty. Glass is half empty is they're way short of where Prime is. Prime, I think in the U.S. is 160, 175 million members or something like that. So they've got a long way to go if the goal is to kind of level up against Prime. But 32 million is a very sizable number, and
population of Canada, by the way.
Yeah, so
our population of this country.
Yeah, and it's happened in a relatively short amount of time. Gives them a lot of data, much more of a one-to-one relationship with customers, in addition to the Prime-like benefits, at least on the delivery side. So I think it's impressive. It's all part of this kind of land grab on convenience as well, and personalization of data. So I think it's encouraging.
So I guess you're getting ready to make you and your former colleagues at Sears getting ready to make a pilgrimage to a store in Illinois. I'm sure it's an emotional moment for you. Sears is closing their last.
Tissues here someplace.
Hey, just get a bit. I'm crying, not you. Sears closing its final Illinois store, as you've described it many times, which is kind of in and of itself a tautology, the longest liquidation sale in retail history. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts?
Well, every once in a while, I get messages from people who say, "Wait, Sears still has stores?" I think a lot of people think that Sears shut their doors several years ago. I think they're down to like 40 or 50 Sears stores and roughly a similar number of Kmart stores. But yeah, the Woodfield Mall store, it's Schaumburg, Illinois, actually opened 50 years ago. And it is the store that was closest to the Sears headquarters. So when I lived in Chicago and I worked for Sears all these years ago, that was the store
Sears Tower.
I was in the most. And that was where we tested a lot of things. And the Woodfield Mall is a huge mall. I don't know where it ranks in terms of sales revenue in the U.S. It's got to be a top 30, top 40 mall. So it's kind of an end of an era for a company that started in Chicago, has been based in Chicago all this time, to not have any stores in the state of Illinois. It's quite remarkable, really. So in a bad way. So yeah, I mean, it just sort of begs the question when you can't have a store like Woodfield be productive. How much longer are these several dozen stores going to be around? So it's just Weekend at Bernie's, just dragging the corpse around a little bit longer, I guess. But,
it reminds me of that old saying, how did you go bankrupt? Very slowly and then very quickly. So we're in the very slowly part. I don't know how and when the very quickly part starts, but you would think it would have anyway.
Yeah, but I was thinking, I left Sears almost 20 years ago, and at that point, for whatever reason, this number sticks in my head, though it's probably wrong. But my recollection was at the time we had 863 what we called full line stores, the mall type full format stores. So to go from 863 to not even 63, I guess at this point, is pretty remarkable. But yeah, it's been a very, very slow decline, and you got to think there's not too much life left in that almost corpse at this point.
Right. Well, let me just wet my wits a little bit with my hint water.
I feel like you're dropping a hint by taking that drink.
And indeed, I am. I just got hint water from our upcoming guest, Kara Golding, who is going to be our guest in a couple of weeks. So let me just, it's delicious water, actually. This is the watermelon.
It is. Yeah.
So it's really nice. I'm really liking it. So anyway, just heads up to all our listeners and viewers. And speaking of that, if you're listening to this on our podcast, thank you. First of all, lots of people are, and be sure and leave us a review because that helps us get to more people. We also have a YouTube channel. And on that YouTube channel, it's our conversation, but there's bonus, we call it bonus content, because you and I talk about the news of the day for longer than we put on to the podcast, just for length. So there's lots of fun, extra bonus content on our YouTube channel. So be sure and tune in. Without further ado, let's get to it.